It's remake time, and it's imperative that we provide an update on one of the biggest fan favorites of all time, Typhlosion. Ever since its adorable first stage evolution Cyndaquil was introduced in Generation 2 as one of Pokemon Gold and Silver's amazing trio of starters, or in the anime as part of Ash's team, this line has captured hearts worldwide, and has endured as one of the most popular fire-type starter Pokemon. When Pokemon Colosseum was released in Generation 3, thrills went through players' hearts when they realized early on that they could snag the second stage of the Johto starters. And though we have no proof for this, we would be willing to bet that Shadow Quilava was the most popular. Typhlosion also received the Hisuian form in Pokemon Legends Arceus, gaining it a new legion of fans. The competitive scene, however, is notorious for taking your favorite Pokemon and ensuring their complete lack of viability. Did this fate befall Typhlosion, or was it another starter success story? We'll find out as we ask, how good was Typhlosion actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. For some reason, Typhlosion was the exact same base stat spread as Charizard, making the already inevitable comparisons between them even more pointed. This meant Typhlosion had decent to good stats, especially speed and special attack, but sadly, it was almost entirely outclassed by Zard as far as Gen 2 OU was concerned. Zard's additional flying typing provided it an amazing immunity to spikes, an incredibly coveted trait, as well as an immunity to Earthquake. Furthermore, it had access to Belly Drum, which, while being high risk, made it one of the strongest, most potentially destructive sweepers around, an especially valuable attribute in the bulk-centric GSC metagame. Typhlosion had nothing nearly so explosive, and thus offered nearly nothing of note to teams. Now, some players did experiment with Typhlosion once in a blue moon, as it did offer something Zard couldn't quite replicate in the form of a mixed attacker, and what made it notable was its pure fire typing. Its lack of a secondary flying typing meant it lacked Charizard's notable electric weakness, meaning Typhlosion could stay in and slug it out with the GSC-defining legendary electrics Zapdos and Raikou. Sadly, Typhlosion was outclassed even in this role, but not by Charizard. It was that other fire flying type, Moltres, that outperformed it. No, Moltres wasn't going to be doing any mixed attacking, but it didn't need to because it was so overwhelmingly powerful with Fire Blast off of its huge special attack stat alone, brute forcing its way through everything, especially in conjunction with Sunny Day, while also having actual defensive utility with Great Bulk and its Spikes immunity. Yeah, there was really no place for Typhlosion in Gen 2 OU, and since it was BL, that meant it got no usage at all. And while that's sad, that is a positive in the sense that Typhlosion could never be allowed into UU, for it would destroy such an enormous portion of the tier effortlessly and warp everything around it. So if you need a positive mental image of Gen 2 competitive Typhlosion, just imagine the chaos it would cause by dropping into UU. Sadly, Gen 3 was pretty much the same story for Typhlosion, except even more cruel this time around, because in addition to wallowing in the shadow of Moltres and Charizard, it was also outclassed by the new fire-type starter, the famed Skarm Bliss killer, the half-fighting Blaziken, which even had that whole not being weak to electric thing, and access to Thunder Punch that Typhlosion had had previously. Except Blaziken could turn this trait into practical use. Typhlosion just didn't offer anything these other fires couldn't do better. The only reason you would ever use it would be because you wanted to use your beloved Typhlosion. Not a bad reason, but certainly far from a competitive one, which is why Typhlosion was just not used. On the bright side, it found itself in BL again, which yes, meant it wouldn't be used at all since it couldn't be seen in UU, but that was because it would rip UU to ribbons if let loose there. So feel free to imagine Typhlosion dethroning Kangaskhan off the throne for the brief time it would be allowed to run the metagame over. Generation 4's massive power creep, notably including Stealth Rock, meant Moltres, Charizard, and Blaziken weren't going to be touching OU, let alone Typhlosion. OU would instead be taken over by another fire-fighting type starter and fire-type legend, Infernape and Heatran, respectively. However, UU was beyond Typhlosion's reach, with Moltres and Blaziken reigning over the tier, as well as the outstanding Arcanine. Note the lack of Charizard among them. Yup, that meant Zard went all the way down to NU, where it was the single best Pokemon in the tier. What hope could there be for Typhlosion then? Funnily enough, there was plenty to be found. Competition was strong to be sure. In addition to King Charizard, there was another excellent fire type around in the form of Magmortar, but Typhlosion carved out its own legitimate niche thanks to a move it received these other fires lacked, Eruption. And unlike the other NU residing fire type with Eruption, Camerupt, Typhlosion actually had the speed to use it effectively, as well as higher special attack. Eruption was so powerful it ensured Typhlosion would always have a place in the tier. Far from being outclassed by Zard, Typhlosion was actually quite an effective partner for it. Scarf Typhlosion could act as almost a sort of second Charizard, coming in after Zard had sufficiently blasted through the opposing team to efficiently clean up the remaining pieces. Typhlosion's pure fire typing also made it much less vulnerable to Stealth Rock than Charizard, which lent itself well to running a choice set. Of course, a huge part of the appeal of Typhlosion was that despite being a Scarfer, its eruption was so powerful that it was able to threaten teams immediately early in the game, synergizing crucially with eruption being at its strongest when Typhlosion was at full HP. Thus, it could perform a number of duties even as a Scarfer, such as early game wall breaker, late game cleaner, and in between act as a generally great revenge killer thanks to its excellent speed stat and great power even without eruption at full power. And that same speed stat was plenty effective without the Scarf too. In fact, by NU standards, 100 speed was downright excellent, and thus Typhlosion really indulged its potentially eruptive power by occasionally donning choice specs, which turned its eruption into the single strongest attack in the tier by far, dealing utterly hilarious amounts of damage. Typhlosion was basically the Kyogre of the tier. Okay, maybe that was a bit far, but the point stands. For its unmatched volcanic power, whether as a Specs, Wall Breaker, or excellent Scarfer, Typhlosion was a legitimately good Pokemon in Generation 4 NU. The RU tier came into existence as the new tier below UU in Generation 5, with NU's placement being pushed down another notch. And as a result of power creep, it wound up resembling DPP UU, a tier where Typhlosion had just about no business being used. RU was ruled over once again by Moltres, as well as Entei and its newly gained Flare Blitz, and yet another new firefighting type starter, Emboar. Meanwhile, Charizard was ruling over NU once again. Were we going to see a repeat of Generation 4? Nope, it was actually Typhlosion who was the higher tiered and the more viable of the two for once. Sure, it was the most specific of the RU fires, but thanks to Specs eruptions, it was also the most powerful. This was huge insofar as it could spam one move and delete pretty much everything in sight. There was no pivoting around its coverage moves like you might do by forcing Moltres to use HP Grass so you could switch to Rant into it. Nah, Typhlosion just spammed Specs eruption and performed outrageous feats like 2-hit KOing a Lomomola. It was also greatly helped by having the best speed of all the fires. Technically, it shared its base 100 speed with Entei, but Entei was locked to an attack boosting adamant nature in order to use Flare Blitz and Extreme Speed, since those moves came from an event, whereas Typhlosion was free to maximize its speed with a timid nature. It was never left wanting for power since Eruption was so insanely strong, and was incredibly valued for its ability to get the jump on hugely important targets like Moltres, as well as offensive Sigil Lift and Jinx. It was nice to see Typhlosion get one over on its rival Charizard, as while on the specific side, it was a legitimately good part of the Gen 5 RU metagame. It was possibly the last thing you wanted to face if you were running a slow defensive team in particular, and its good speed meant it wasn't exactly a slouch against offense either. Generation 6's power creep saw Typhlosion return to NU, where it quickly established itself as one of the most ferocious Pokemon in the tier. It didn't quite pack the utility of the faster, partially psychic Delphox, but it was right behind it in terms of viability due to how overwhelmingly powerful it was. In fact, throughout X and Y, Typhlosion was somewhat of a source of controversy in the tier, with some players proclaiming that it was too fast and its main move too spammable for how absurdly powerful it was, making it too easy to blast holes in teams. It had some decent checks like Assault Vest Thick Fat Hariyama, as well as the fact that it needed anti-hazard support more than your average Pokemon, and that was generally sufficient to keep Typhlosion from being too widely hated. But then Auraz came around, and Typhlosion joined forces with another incredibly powerful fire type. The newly added Mega Camerupt, Fire Spam as it was called, immediately became one of the most dominant offensive forces in the tier, blasting through their few answers through combined brute force. Players were immediately demanding, if not outright, at least serious consideration that both fire types were broken, far more forcefully and in far greater numbers than the X and Y Typhlosion crowd. And the following metagame developments wound up vindicating this and then some. Indeed, arguably the only thing preventing their consideration was the presence of several more immediately pressing Pokemon in the tier, which were examined first: Mega Steelix, Heliolisk, and Feraligatr. Afterwards though, and once Kabutops had left the tier as well, Typhlosion and Mega Camerupt really started spitting hot fire, and the flash melting ferocity of their bars could no longer be ignored or denied. Sure, one could make decent theoretical arguments against them, mostly Typhlosion's frailty not just in hitting the field in the face of abundant priority to go alongside its hazard weakness, weakening the threat of its eruption, but being able to pick and choose Typhlosion's spots with U-turn and Volt Switch abusing teammates, as well as a strong focus on dealing with hazards, meant that in practice, it was going to be getting on the field effortlessly and ripping everything up even more effortlessly still. Eruption did smash everything, but there was also the fact that one prediction from Typhlosion's coverage moves would immediately destroy one of the few Pokemon that didn't immediately die to Eruption. HP Grass and you'd kiss your Rhydon goodbye, for example. Of course, the fact that you could always just play it safe and Erupt was absurd as well. It's not exactly like Typhlosion ceased to be a threat once Eruption was no longer at full power. No, far from it. It still had the speed and the power for its Fire Blast to blow through an enormous portion of the metagame, especially when supported by its coverage. Plus, facilitating those ideal Eruption conditions was far from difficult, and so you'd regularly see Typhlosion absolutely destroying so-called checks like Archeops and Samurott as they failed to switch in. To make matters even nastier, Typhlosion could even switch its game up beyond just running specs. For example, it was highly adept at exchanging its specs and instead running a charcoal set with Will-O-Wisp, completely ruining Hariyama switch-ins. Not that Yama didn't tend to get overwhelmed over time to begin with, since it was tasked with dealing with more than just Typhlosion, but it did let Typhlo deal with it more directly, as well as completely ending Regirock's ability to do anything. Although, of course, Regirock could get focus blasted by choice sets as well. Typhlosion could really do it all. It could Wild Charge its way through Mantine, it could Hidden Power Water its way through Mega Camerupt, it could Earthquake its way through Assault Vest Lantern, Magmortar, and other Typhlosion. Oraz had also gifted Typhlosion its hidden ability Flash Fire, meaning one of the most reliable ways to stop Typhlosion from brute forcing its way through Eruption was your own Typhlosion. In fact, that was the main reason why charcoal sets became popular, because if Choice Typhlosion number 1 switched into Choice Typhlosion number 2 using a fire move, Choice Typhlosion number 2 wouldn't want to switch out because it would surely lose a Pokemon in return, and the only way to prevent that was to stay in as Choice Typhlosion number 1 attacked, even if you were locked into a fire move already. So you'd wind up in a ridiculous stalemate where the two Typhlosion would just fire move each other repeatedly. With a charcoal set, you could take advantage of this to completely ruin the other player's Typhlosion, giving you a major leg up. The player base recognized just how largely and unhealthy Typhlosion's volcanic shadow loomed over the tier and eventually wound up banning it alongside its buddy Mega Camerupt. Sadly, Typhlosion wasn't able to reach any sort of success in RU. The tier was faster, stronger, and most of all, bulkier, making it much more difficult for it to pull off its eruptions consistently. The fact that it contributed almost nothing to a team's defenses was also not appealing in the balance-centric RU metagame. This wasn't just conjecture based on a lack of trying either, as Typhlosion actually got so much usage it rose from NUBL to RU proper, but this was almost surely because of its status as a starter, which made newer players want to spam it, because it wasn't from its viability at all. Still, this wasn't a problem at all, as Typhlosion had just scored its greatest accomplishment of its competitive career. Sure, Game Freak's favorite Charizard had 2 Mega Forms running around OU, but when it came to the base forms, Zard was in NU again, whereas Typhlosion had ripped up that same tier up so badly that it had to be banned from it. Charizard had been in direct competition with it, and Typhlosion had unquestionably come out on top. So all in all, Generation 6 was Typhlosion's greatest success yet. And as for VGC, Typhlosion does have Eruption, which is a very strong move in doubles due to its immense damage and the ability to double target without the risk of missing. But unfortunately, there was very little placements for Typhlosion. The few notable placements we found definitely showcased player creativity though. Ashton Cox placed 4th with Typhlosion, facilitated by Megazard Y's son at the Florida Regionals. Then 2 more Typhlosions showed up in 2015, with Jim Sullivan using Typhlosion on an all-starter team to reach 15th at the Melbourne Regionals, and Hamish G placing 6th with it in the juniors division of the Australian Nationals. Congratulations to these players for doing well with Typhlosion. Generation 7 brought lots of power creep, and while most of that worked against the famously frail Typhlosion, it could take advantage of Firium Z to launch absolutely nuclear Inferno overdrives, giving it incredible power even when Eruption wasn't at full power. It started off by dropping to PU in its initial stage, but immediately moved up to NU by usage, denying everyone the chance to see just how hilariously it would have crushed PU. On the bright side, Typhlosion was quite good in NU, although it had strong competition with Charizard, who was also an excellent Z-move user with both the speed-boosting Z Sunny Day or the all-out sweeper of Z Celebrate. The presence of the powerful Pyroar also meant Typhlosion wasn't going to be a go-to fire type by default. However, as always, these other fires could only stare in awe as Typhlosion slapped on the specs and started spamming Eruption. While not broken anymore, specs ensured Typhlosion was one of the scariest Pokemon in NU, always able to pose a threat that blasted apart the entire tier through sheer power. This lasted throughout Sun and Moon, and then Ultra Sun and Moon came around, dropping Typhlosion back to PU. And to the delight of everyone who was finally able to witness its brief destruction of the tier that had been so briefly promised previously, it was pretty simple. Choice Scarf immediately dropped anything offensive, whereas Choice Specs brutalized everything else. Magmortar had already been considered to be too much for PU, and indeed wound up getting banned not long after Typhlosion's little cameo, and Typhlosion pretty much showed up, outdid it entirely, and was quick banned. There's just something special about watching the not fully evolved Pokemon that comprise a good majority of the PU tier getting eviscerated so hilariously and over the top by something as overpowered as Specs Typhlosion Eruption. Arceus Forbidden got a Flash Fire boost. Typhlosion returned to NU through usage, but unfortunately, it was in another ORAS RU situation. The tier had evolved in Ultra Sun and Moon to become faster, stronger, and bulkier. Typhlosion just couldn't fit into a metagame so centered around the likes of Slowking, Vaporeon, Aerodactyl, and other amazing fires in Incineroar and Delphox. It wasn't outright terrible, it just wouldn't ever get used in a serious situation. Nevertheless, if that was the price to pay for another successful generation, that was more than good enough for Typhlosion, who racked up another strong NU appearance in Sun and Moon and had utterly obliterated PU in Ultra Sun and Moon in the 2 seconds it was allowed down there, leaving naught but smithereens in its wake. Typhlosion took Generation 8 off, then returned with a vengeance with Generation 9's release of Pokemon Home. Its base form hasn't really done much yet, as at the time of this video, it still sits in NU, where it's decent if a tad overlooked. Well, why is it overlooked, and why are we now referring to it as its base form? Well, because Gen 9 has released the Hisuian Typhlosion from Pokemon Legends Arceus into the mainline series, and it is an incredibly interesting Pokemon that has already made quite a splash. Hisuian Typhlosion is not just fire, but also ghost, meaning it has 2 of the scariest stabs in the game now. Its new hidden ability is Frisk, which lets it identify the held item the opposing Pokemon is carrying. Now it's a little slower, with base 95 speed as opposed to its previous 100, but it's still plenty fast. It also lost 5 base HP, which doesn't really make much of a difference. These losses are very, very much worth it, however, as the collective 10 base points it lost between speed and HP were added to special attack, bringing Hisuian Typhlosion to an amazing base 119 special attack stat. And if you thought its eruptions were strong before, it's not just about sheer strength either. It received a new move called Infernal Parade, a ghost type special attack sitting at 60 base power. Why use it over Shadow Ball? Well, putting aside the fact that it could easily use both if it desired, Infernal Parade packs a nasty 30% chance to burn, and does double damage if the opponent is already status, meaning that spamming Infernal Parade can actually help it make it stronger once the burns are afflicted. It's basically a cross between Lava Plume and Hex, which is a brutal combination. You can't even safely switch to fire types to avoid being burned, because Infernal Parade is a stab ghost move that's going to hit them quite well. Now, Hisuian Typhlosion wasn't thinking about spamming Infernal Parade when it first hit UU though. It was too focused on pairing with Torkoal and unleashing sun boosted fire moves left and right. Its eruptions and flamethrowers reduced everything to ash. It was a rather niche playstyle thanks to the popularity of Chili Reception Slowking and a lack of a good abuser besides Hisuian Typhlosion, which is why Hisuian Typhlosion actually dropped to RU by usage. But whenever Sun did appear in UU, it was with Hisuian Typhlosion. Its immunity to Hisuian Arcanine's extreme speed and Breloom's Mach Punch was outstanding, as well as its quadruple resistance to low kicks' first impression. Its secondary stab Shadow Ball was excellent as well, ensuring Flash Fire Ceruledge wouldn't want to switch into it at all, while also threatening the quad fire resistant Hisuian Arcanine. Everything else though just got eruptioned into oblivion. Even the bulky Skeledirge got blasted apart by 2 of them. Oh, this wasn't just UU either. Torkoal was actually RU at the time, and Hisuian Typhlosion paired with it to obliterate the tier even more effortlessly. Even the presence of Tyranitar couldn't dissuade it. That's what Focus Blast was for. Torkoal rising to OU meant that Hisuian Typhlosion's UU usage came to a close, and it wasn't going to be spamming Sun Boosted Ferocity and RU anymore. But this is where its utility has come in. It has adopted an excellent heavy-duty boot set, using its newfound survivability to help block Rapid Spin, which it's quite good at, considering how hard it shuts down Serena and Fortress, while dishing out Will-O-Wisps that wear down the opposition and immediately power up its Infernal Parade, letting it be both support and a threat. It'll be interesting to see how Hisuian Typhlosion continues to progress throughout Generation 9, especially since heavy-duty boots means that it can stay at full health to spam Eruption more easily, if it chooses to use such a set. Base Typhlosion will almost surely find some sort of defined niche as well, of course, you never want to forget about its capacity for eruption. And finally, for VGC, Hisui and Typhlosion became legal during the release of the Regulation D rule set. Typhlosion's Hisuian form definitely outshines its base form in doubles due to having a higher special attack to facilitate eruption, as well as ghost stab. On Sun teams, Hisui and Typhlosion can be used with the Torkoals that are already facilitating the past Paradox Pokemon's photosynthesis, like Fluttermane and co. However, the only person to place at a regional level or higher tournament so far with Typhlosion was Ivan Amate at 20th place at the Road to Yokohama online tournament. Unfortunately, Typhlosion did not have any notable placements at Worlds a month later, as it could have possibly had a bit more time to perform if there were more regional tournaments before Worlds with Regulation D rules, but alas, it didn't work out that way. And that's it. So how great was Typhlosion actually? Well, its competitive career started out roughly, as it was outclassed left and right in its first 2 generations, especially by its most famous point of comparison, Charizard, with its only solace being that it was too good for Yu. Once it received Eruption in Generation 4, however, it really took off. Scarf and Specs Eruptions were both among the scariest moves in the game and became Typhlosion's calling card. It ensured it had a strong niche in Generation 4 NU, even when other fires like Charizard and Magmortar were running around, and even won in Generation 5 RU, placing it a tier above Charizard. Sure, Charizard got the Megas in Gen 6, but which of the 2 fire starters in base form was the one that smashed up NU so badly it needed to be banned? Yeah, Typhlosion. It wound up getting banned hilariously quickly from PU in Generation 7, while turning in another strong NU performance throughout Sun and Moon, and now in Generation 9, its half-ghost Hisuian counterpart has been making waves already, both in terms of newfound utility and sheer power. Overall, Typhlosion is one of the most overlooked fire starters competitively, but when you examine it more closely, you see just how excellent a career it has had. There's little scarier than a full health Typhlosion spamming Eruption. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Typhlosion? What would you give Hisui and Typhlosion to make it OU? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.